In the quiet stillness of a remote forest, the sunlight filtered through the tall, ancient trees, casting flickering shadows onto the mossy ground. It was the kind of place where nature spoke louder than words, where every whisper of the wind seemed to carry secrets of its own. But on this particular day, the serenity of the forest was broken by the faint sound of a car engine, growing louder as it wound its way down the narrow dirt path. Inside the car sat a young girl, her wide, curious eyes darting between the trees as they passed. She loved the outdoors, always had, and though her life had recently taken an unimaginable turn, she found solace in the thought of nature's embrace. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this trip into the woods would change her life forever. Her name was Lily, a child whose resilience belied her years. At just 9 years old, she had already endured more than most adults could fathom. Adopted at the age of 4, she had believed she finally found her forever family, a loving couple who had promised her safety, comfort, and the warmth of a home. For a while, it seemed like a dream come true. There were family dinners, bedtime stories, and laughter that echoed through the walls of their modest suburban home. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when least expected, and for Lily, that curveball came in the form of a tragic accident. The details of the accident were murky, as though her mind had intentionally blurred the memory to protect her fragile heart. All she knew was that she went to bed one night as a carefree little girl who loved to run and play, and woke up to a world where her legs no longer worked as they once had. The doctors used words she didn't understand: spinal injury, permanent damage. But what she did understand was the shift in her parents' eyes. The love they once showed so freely seemed to falter, replaced by something colder, more distant. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Perhaps they were just overwhelmed or scared, just as she was. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the truth became undeniable. They didn't look at her the same way anymore. Lily's wheelchair became a symbol of her new reality, but to her parents, it seemed to symbolize something else entirely: burden, inconvenience, a life they hadn't signed up for. The once warm and lively household grew cold and quiet. Conversations turned to whispers, and whispers turned to silence. Lily felt the change but didn't know how to fix it. She tried harder to please them, to be the daughter they had once adored, but no matter how hard she tried, nothing seemed to thaw the frost that had settled in their hearts. Then, one morning, her parents announced they were going on a special trip. They smiled, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. They packed a bag for her, filled with her favorite snacks and a cozy blanket, and loaded her into the car. Lily's heart fluttered with cautious hope. Maybe this trip was their way of making things right, of showing her that they still cared. The drive was long and winding, the kind that lulled her into a false sense of security. She stared out the window, marveling at the beauty of the forest as it grew denser with each passing mile. When the car finally came to a stop, her parents stepped out and began unloading her things. They spoke in hushed tones, their movements hurried. Something felt off, but Lily couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Are we camping?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement despite the unease creeping into her chest. Her mother avoided her gaze, while her father muttered something about fresh air being good for her. They wheeled her to a clearing surrounded by towering trees and soft patches of moss. It was beautiful, almost magical, but the pit in Lily's stomach only grew. They left her there. It happened so quickly, so unexpectedly, that Lily didn't even have time to process it. One moment, her parents were there, adjusting her blanket and reassuring her with empty smiles. The next, they were gone, the sound of the car engine fading into the distance. She called out for them, her voice echoing through the forest, but there was no answer. Panic set in as the reality of her situation hit her. She was alone, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how to get back home, or if she even had a home to go back to. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon. A small, growing voice told her the truth. They weren't coming back. The forest seemed to come alive in the darkness, the rustling of leaves and distant animal calls adding to her fear. But as the night stretched on, something remarkable happened. Lurley's tears dried, and a sense of determination began to take root. She had survived so much already. She could survive this too. She looked up at the canopy of stars above, their light piercing through the darkness, and made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let this be the end of her story. Little did she know, the forest held secrets of its own, and karma, as they say, works in mysterious ways. The night was colder than Lily had anticipated. The thin blanket her parents had left barely kept the chill away, and the forest around her seemed to hum with life. Rustling leaves, distant animal cries, and the whisper of wind weaving through the trees. Each sound felt amplified, as if the forest itself was watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. She sat there, clutching the blanket tightly, her mind swirling with memories and unanswered questions. How could they do this to her? They were the ones who had promised to take care of her, who had told her she was their family. That promise now felt like a cruel joke, one that echoed through the empty spaces of her heart. As the hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, Lurley's thoughts turned to the life she had before her adoption. The memories were faint, blurry fragments of a world she'd barely remembered. A small apartment with peeling wallpaper, the smell of cooking that filled the air, and the sound of her birth mother's laughter, soft but warm, like a comforting melody. Her biological mother had struggled to provide for her, juggling multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. But even in the face of hardship, there had always been love. She had been too young to understand why her mother had to let her go, why one day she was handed to a social worker and told it was for the best. She had cried, of course, but in her heart, she believed her mother's words, that she was being given a chance at a better life. That better life had seemed to arrive when her adoptive parents entered the picture. They had been everything she'd dreamed of, kind, attentive, and full of promises for a brighter future. For the first time, she had her own room, filled with toys and books she could call her own. They had taken her on trips to the zoo, celebrated her birthdays with elaborate cakes, and tucked her in at night with stories that made her feel safe. But now, sitting alone in the dark forest, those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. The couple who had once been her saviors had become strangers, their betrayal cutting deeper than any physical pain she had ever known. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, Lily's tears had dried, leaving behind a quiet resolve. She knew she couldn't sit there forever, waiting for someone to rescue her. She needed to figure out how to survive. Her first instinct was to search through the small bag they had left behind. It contained a few granola bars, a bottle of water, and a flashlight, hardly enough for an extended stay in the wilderness. Still, she was grateful for anything that might help. She ate one of the granola bars slowly, savoring each bite as though it were the last meal she would ever have. With the daylight came a renewed sense of awareness. The forest, though vast and intimidating, was also beautiful. Sunlight danced through the leaves, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply observe, to take in the world around her. She noticed a squirrel darting up a tree, its tiny movements quick and purposeful. She invited its confidence, its sense of belonging in this untamed world. It didn't feel lost or abandoned. It was home. As the day wore on, Lily tried to piece together what she should do next. She had no sense of direction, no way of knowing how far the nearest road or town might be. Her wheelchair, though sturdy, wasn't designed for navigating rough terrain. Every few feet, it would get caught on roots or uneven ground, forcing her to stop and wrestle it free. She pushed herself as far as she could, her arms aching from the effort. All the while, she kept an ear out for any signs of life, footsteps, voices, the distant rumble of a car. But the forest remained stubbornly silent. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, Lali's frustration was beginning to mount. She felt trapped, both physically and emotionally, as though the weight of her situation was pressing down on her like an invisible force. But even in her darkest moments, a small flicker of hope refused to be extinguished. She reminded herself that she had survived so much already: her injury, the loss of her birth mother, the coldness of her adoptive parents. She was stronger than she looked, stronger than anyone had given her credit for. That night, as she sat by the faint glow of her flashlight, she began to reflect on the concept of karma. Her birth mother had once told her that the universe had a way of balancing itself out, of ensuring that those who acted with cruelty or selfishness would eventually face the consequences of their actions. At the time, Lily hadn't fully understood what her mother meant, but now, sitting alone in the forest, those words took on a new meaning. She couldn't control what her parents had done to her, but maybe, just maybe, the universe could. The forest seemed to respond to her thoughts, its sounds shifting in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. For the first time, she felt as though she wasn't entirely alone. It was a strange sensation, one she couldn't quite explain. The trees, the animals, the very air around her, they all seemed to be watching, waiting. She didn't know if it was her imagination or something more, but it gave her a sense of comfort, however fleeting. The next morning, Lily woke to the sound of distant footsteps. Her heart leaped with a mix of hope and fear. Was it her parents coming back for her? Or was it someone else entirely? She stayed perfectly still, her ears straining to catch every sound. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until finally a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't her parents. It was a man, tall and rugged, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He carried a backpack and wore a look of cautious curiosity as he approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their eyes locked in a silent exchange. Lily didn't know whether to feel relief or apprehension. The man knelt down to her level, his gaze softening as he took in the sight of her wheelchair and the small bag at her side. "What are you doing out here all alone, kid?" he asked, his voice gentle but tinged with concern. Lily hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "My parents, they left me here," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. He didn't press her for details, instead shifting his focus to her immediate needs. "Are you hurt? Do you have enough to eat?" he asked, his questions coming in rapid succession. She shook her head, tears threatening to spill over once again. But before she could crumble, the man placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said firmly. "You're not alone anymore." Though she didn't know it yet, this chance encounter would set into motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but also the lives of those who had abandoned her. The forest had its own way of delivering justice, and karma, as her mother had once said, was always watching. Lily hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the man's face. There was something kind in his expression, a genuine concern she hadn't seen in a long time. But trust didn't come easily anymore, not after what she'd been through. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she wasn't alone now, but the sting of betrayal was fresh, and her heart was guarded. "I'm okay," she said softly, even though it wasn't entirely true. The man seemed to sense her hesitation, choosing not to push her. Instead, he stood up and surveyed the surrounding forest, his face unreadable as he calculated their next steps. "I'm Jack," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. "I come out here a lot, mostly to camp, sometimes to clear my head. But I've never seen anyone out here like this. You're lucky I found you. Lucky." The word felt strange to Lily. Was it luck that had brought him here, or was it something else entirely? She nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. Jack crouched back down to her level, his tone softening. "We'll figure this out," he said, his words carrying a quiet determination. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe." As they began to move, Jack carefully pushed Lily's wheelchair through the uneven terrain, his movements steady and deliberate. He spoke sparingly, asking her only what was necessary: if she was hungry, if she was cold, if she needed to rest. Lily answered in short sentences, her mind racing with questions of her own. Who was this man really? Why was he out here alone? And most importantly, what would happen when they left the forest? She didn't dare ask, afraid of the answers she might receive. The journey was slow, the forest dense and unyielding. Jack seemed to know his way around, navigating the twisted paths with a quiet confidence. As they walked, he pointed out small details she hadn't noticed before, the faint tracks of deer, the hidden nests of birds high up in the trees. For a brief moment, Lily allowed herself to be distracted, to marvel at the intricacies of the natural world. It was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind, and she clung to it like a lifeline. But as the hours wore on, her exhaustion began to catch up with her. Her arms ached from holding herself steady, and her stomach growled in protest. Jack must have noticed her fatigue because he soon stopped, setting down his backpack and pulling out a small thermos. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "It's just soup, but it's warm." Lily hesitated before taking it, the simple act of kindness feeling foreign after everything she'd endured. The soup was salty and comforting, a small reminder that she hadn't completely given up. As they rested, Jack began to open up, his words cautious but genuine. He told her about his own struggles, how he had lost someone he cared about deeply, and how the forest had become his refuge. "It's quiet out here," he said, his voice tinged with melancholy. "When the world feels too loud, this is where I come to think." Lily listened intently, his story resonating with her in ways she hadn't expected. Though their experiences were vastly different, they shared a common thread, a sense of being lost, of searching for something they couldn't quite name. But even as they bonded, an unspoken tension lingered in the air. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that Jack wasn't telling her everything, that there was more to his story than he was letting on. At the same time, she wrestled with her own guilt and anger. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand answers from her adoptive parents, to make them explain why they had abandoned her. But another part of her feared the truth, afraid it would only deepen the wounds they had already inflicted. As night fell once again, they set up a makeshift camp. Jack built a small fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across the forest floor. Lily sat quietly, watching the flames dance as her thoughts churned. She couldn't help but wonder what her parents were doing at that very moment. Were they sitting comfortably in their warm home, pretending she didn't exist? Or were they racked with guilt, regretting the decision they had made? The not knowing was the hardest part, a gnawing uncertainty that refused to let her rest. Jack must have sensed her unease because he spoke up, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said, "but I want you to know that whatever happened, it's not your fault." His words struck a chord deep within her, breaking through the wall she had built around herself. She wanted to believe him, to let go of the self-blame that had taken root in her heart. But it wasn't that simple. Healing, she realized, wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. As they sat by the fire, the forest around them seemed to come alive. The sound of rustling leaves grew louder, and the distant howl of a wolf sent a shiver down Lily's spine. Jack stood up, his eyes scanning the darkness, his body tense. "Stay here," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He grabbed a flashlight and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Lily alone with her thoughts. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each passing second amplifying her anxiety. What was out there? And why had Jack seemed so worried? She clutched the blanket tightly, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. But just as her fear threatened to overwhelm her, Jack returned, his expression unreadable. "It's nothing," he said, though his tone didn't quite match his words. Lily didn't press him, but the unease in her chest remained. As the fire crackled softly, Lily found herself drifting into a restless sleep, her dreams a tangled mix of memories and fears. She dreamed of her mother, her warm smile and gentle hands, and of her adoptive parents, their faces cold and distant. She dreamed of the forest, its trees closing in around her, their branches reaching out like arms. And somewhere in the distance, she heard a voice, soft, almost inaudible, calling her name. When she woke, the fire had burned down to embers, and Jack was sitting nearby, his face illuminated by the faint glow. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. They weren't alone in the forest, and whatever, or whoever, was out there wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The forest seemed darker than ever, the silence unnerving. Lily could feel her heart racing, each beat echoing in her ears. Jack sat quietly by the fading embers, his eyes darting to the shadows, his jaw tight. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The stillness of the forest, once calming, now felt suffocating. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made Lily flinch, her hands gripping the edges of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned white. As Jack pushed her wheelchair through the uneven terrain, the forest seemed to shift. The familiar landmarks they had passed earlier now looked unfamiliar, twisted in the dim light. Lily's mind raced with questions. Were they being followed? Were Jack's fears real? Or was this the result of days of tension and exhaustion? She wanted to believe they would make it out of the forest, but doubt crept in with every step they took. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of their presence. Jack's silence only made things worse. He didn't explain, didn't reassure her. He simply moved forward, his grip on the handles of the wheelchair firm, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Lily tried to focus on the path in front of them, but her thoughts betrayed her, pulling her back to memories of her parents. She couldn't help but wonder if they were thinking about her at that moment. Did they regret what they had done? Did they miss her even a little? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and painful. Suddenly, Jack stopped. Lily's heart sank as she looked up at him, his posture tense, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Lily strained to hear, but the forest was eerily quiet. And then it came, a faint sound, barely audible at first, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. It wasn't far. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and she glanced back, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the darkness revealed nothing, only deepening her fear. Jack crouched beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay quiet. Don't move." He pulled a small knife from his backpack, holding it with a steady hand. Lily's pulse quickened as she realized the gravity of their situation. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't friendly. She wanted to scream, to tell Jack they needed to run, but her voice wouldn't come. Instead, she sat frozen, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and Jack moved to shield her, his back to the noise. Lily felt tears welling in her eyes, the fear overwhelming. She thought about everything she had been through, all the pain, the betrayal, and the heartbreak. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Not here, not now. The footsteps stopped suddenly, the silence even more terrifying than the noise. Jack turned his head slightly, his eyes scanning the forest with an intensity Lily had never seen before. And then it happened. A branch snapped somewhere to their right, the sound echoing through the trees. Jack spun toward the noise, his knife raised, his body tense and ready. Lily's breath came in short gasps as she tried to steady herself, to prepare for whatever was coming. She thought she saw movement, a flash of something darting between the trees, but it was too quick to make out. The forest felt alive now, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a warning. Jack's voice was low and urgent. "We need to keep moving." Now, he didn't wait for her response, his hands gripping the wheelchair as he pushed her forward with renewed urgency. Lily didn't argue, her fear silencing any protests. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer together, their branches clawing at the sky. The path was uneven, and the wheelchair jolted with every root and rock, but Jack didn't slow down. Lily's mind raced as they moved, the tension unbearable. She thought about the last few days, about Jack and the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Who was he really? Could she trust him? And what had he seen that had him so on edge? The questions burned in her mind. But there was no time to dwell on them. Survival was all that mattered now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, her fear almost tangible. She tried to focus on the present, on the path ahead, but her mind kept drifting to the shadows behind them. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something or someone was following them. The fear was paralyzing, and she struggled to keep her breathing steady. Jack suddenly stopped again, his hand raised in a silent signal for her to stay still. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the forest floor. Lily held her breath, her eyes following his gaze. She didn't see anything at first, but then she noticed it, a faint set of footprints, fresh and deliberate. Her stomach dropped as she realized the truth. They weren't alone. Someone had been following them, tracking their every move. Jack's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. He motioned for her to stay quiet as he stood and began pushing the wheelchair again, his pace quicker now, his movements more urgent. Lily wanted to ask him what they were going to do, but the fear in his eyes silenced her. She trusted him, at least for now, but the fear was overwhelming. The forest seemed to close in around them, the darkness impenetrable, the silence deafening. The sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, more deliberate. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. Lily's heart raced as she glanced back, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. And then she saw it, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, moving toward them. She gasped, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Jack." He didn't respond, his focus entirely on getting them out of the forest. But the figure was getting closer, its movements deliberate and unyielding. Lily felt a surge of panic, her hands gripping the edges of the wheelchair as she tried to steady herself. The forest seemed alive now, its shadows shifting and moving, its silence broken by the sound of their pursuer. Jack's voice was firm but low. "Hold on, Lily. We're almost there." But she could hear the doubt in his voice, the uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, to trust that they would make it out, but the fear was too strong. The figure behind them was gaining ground, its presence a constant reminder of the danger they were in. As they pushed forward, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the path twisting and turning with no end in sight. Lily's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, the tension building with every step. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: they were running out of time. Lily's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of her wheelchair, her eyes darting between the shifting shadows of the forest. The figure pursuing them felt closer now, its presence pressing on her like an unseen weight. Jack was breathing heavily, his pace quickening with every step, his words clipped as he urged her forward. "Just hold on, Lily. We can't stop now," he muttered, his voice laced with both determination and fear. But even as he spoke, Lily could sense something was different. The air around them had changed, charged with an energy she couldn't quite place, as if the forest itself was watching. The footsteps behind them suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was more unsettling than any sound. Lily turned her head, expecting to see the figure still in pursuit, but there was nothing, just the endless expanse of trees and darkness. Her pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He paused, glancing back, his face pale and drawn. "What is it?" he asked, but she could tell he already knew. They both felt it. Something wasn't right. Before Lily could respond, a sound shattered the silence. It wasn't footsteps this time, but a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl. It echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees, making the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. Jack's grip on the wheelchair tightened, his knuckles white. "That's not human," he said under his breath, his eyes scanning the shadows. Lily's heart pounded as she tried to process what he had just said. If it wasn't human, then what was it? The question hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. As they stood frozen, the growling grew louder, more distinct, and then came the unmistakable sound of movement, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. But this time, it wasn't just one set of footsteps. It was many, coming from all directions. Jack spun around, his eyes wide with panic. "We're surrounded," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Lily's stomach dropped as she realized the truth. Whatever was out there wasn't alone. Jack crouched beside her, his voice urgent but calm. "Listen to me, Lily. No matter what happens, you stay quiet. Do you understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The sounds were getting closer now, the growling more intense, and Lily could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath her. She clutched the edges of her wheelchair, her mind racing. How had it come to this? Just days ago, she had been abandoned, left to fend for herself in this unforgiving forest. And now she was facing something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The first shadow appeared, darting between the trees so quickly that Lily almost doubted what she had seen. But then another came, and another, their shapes indistinct but undeniably there. Jack stood, his knife held tightly in his hand, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear she could see in his eyes. But before he could take another step, a loud crack echoed through the forest, followed by a blinding flash of light. Lily cried out, shielding her eyes, and when the light faded, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing just a few feet away was a figure unlike anything she had ever seen. It was tall and imposing, its form shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Jack stepped in front of her, his knife raised, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence overwhelming, its gaze fixed on Lily. For a moment, everything was still. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. And then, without warning, the figure spoke. Its voice was deep and resonant, filling the air around them. "Why are you here?" it asked, its tone more curious than threatening. Jack hesitated, his grip on the knife faltering. We didn't mean to intrude," he said, his voice shaking. "We're just trying to get out of the forest." The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You were not meant to leave," it said, its words sending a chill down Lily's spine. She felt a surge of panic, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Why weren't they meant to leave? What did this figure want from them? She glanced at Jack, hoping he had a plan, but his expression was one of helplessness. Before either of them could respond, the growling returned, louder and closer than ever. The figure stepped back, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared, and the forest erupted into chaos. Shakes darted between the trees, their movements erratic and unnerving. Jack grabbed the handles of Lily's wheelchair, his voice urgent. "We have to move. Now." But as he tried to push her forward, one of the shakes emerged from the darkness, blocking their path. It was unlike anything Lily had ever seen, its form twisted and grotesque, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jack stepped in front of her, his knife raised, but the creature didn't attack. Instead, it let out a low, rumbling growl, its gaze fixed on Lily. She felt a chill run through her as the creature took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Jack lunged at it, his knife slashing through the air, but the creature was too fast. It dodged his attack with ease, its movements almost graceful. Lily's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, her fear paralyzing her. She wanted to scream, to tell Jack to run, but her voice wouldn't come. The creature let out another growl, its focus never wavering from her. And then, to her horror, it spoke. Its voice was guttural and distorted, but the words were clear. "She is the key," it said, its gaze piercing. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she tried to process what it had just said. The key to what? She didn't understand, but the creature's words filled her with a sense of dread. Before she could say anything, the creature lunged at Jack, its movements a blur. He fought back with everything he had, but it was clear he was outmatched. Lily watched in horror as the creature knocked him to the ground, its claws tearing through his jacket. "Jack," she cried, her voice finally breaking through the fear. He looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Go, Lily, get out of here," he shouted, his voice strained. But she couldn't leave him. She couldn't abandon the one person who had stood by her when no one else had. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Lily grabbed a heavy branch from the ground and swung it at the creature with all her strength. It let out a roar of pain, its focus shifting to her. Jack took the opportunity to grab his knife and stab the creature in the side, causing it to retreat into the shadows. The forest fell silent once again, the air heavy with tension. Jack stumbled to his feet, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice weak but determined. Lily nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the arms of her wheelchair. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain: the forest wasn't done with them yet. And whatever was coming next, they would have to face it together. Lily's chest heaved as Jack pushed her wheelchair forward, his steps unsteady from exhaustion and pain. The forest seemed alive now, each tree a silent witness to their struggle. The air was thick and heavy, and even the shadows felt closer, pressing in around them. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, funneled towards some unseen destination. Jack's grip on the handles of her wheelchair tightened, his knuckles white, but he didn't say a word. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the distant rustle of movement somewhere in the darkness. Suddenly, the growling returned, low and guttural, and this time it was all around them. Jack spun around, his knife in hand, but there was no clear direction to face. The shadows moved, shifting and swirling like living things, and Lily realized with a sinking feeling that they were surrounded. Jack stepped in front of her, his body a shield, but she could see the fear in his eyes. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm but shaking. The first creature stepped into the clearing, its grotesque form illuminated by the silver light. Then another and another, until a circle of them had formed, their glowing eyes fixed on Lily. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, but then something unexpected happened. The creatures didn't attack. They simply stood there, watching, as if waiting for something. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and Lily felt as if she couldn't breathe. Then, the ground beneath the ancient tree began to rumble, and a deep, resonant voice echoed through the clearing. "She has returned," it said, the words vibrating through the air like a physical force. Lily's heart raced as she looked around, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Jack took a step back, his eyes wide with shock. "What's happening?" he whispered, but Lily had no answer. The voice spoke again, this time softer, almost reverent. "The one who was cast aside, the one who was left to die. She is the key to balance." Lily's mind raced, the words swirling in her head. The key. That was what the creature had said earlier. But what did it mean? She looked at Jack, her voice trembling. "I don't understand. Why me?" she asked, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath the tree split open, revealing a glowing fissure that pulsed with light. The creatures stepped back, their growls subdued, as if they, too, were in awe of what was happening. Lily's wheelchair began to move, not by Jack's hand, but as if pulled by an unseen force. "Lily," Jack shouted, grabbing the handles, but the pull was too strong. "Let me go," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "I have to see this through." Jack hesitated, his eyes searching hers, and then reluctantly he let go. The wheelchair rolled forward, stopping at the edge of the fissure. Lily felt the warmth of the light on her face, and for the first time she didn't feel fear. She felt peace. The voice spoke again, this time directed at her. "You have suffered, but through your suffering you have awakened a power greater than fear. The forest has chosen you." The light grew brighter, enveloping Lily completely. Jack shielded his eyes, calling her name, but she couldn't hear him anymore. Images flashed before her eyes, memories of her parents abandoning her, of the days she spent alone in the forest, of the creatures that had both terrified and protected her. And then she saw something new, a vision of the forest thriving, its creatures living in harmony, its energy balanced and whole. She understood now. She wasn't just a victim, she was a catalyst. When the light faded, Lily was no longer in her wheelchair. She stood in the clearing, her legs strong and steady beneath her. Jack stared at her in shock, his mouth open, but no words coming out. The creatures bowed their heads, their forms less grotesque now, almost beautiful in the soft light. The voice spoke one final time. "The balance has been restored. Go now, and remember what it means to be chosen." Lily turned to Jack, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm okay," she said, her voice trembling but strong. He rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, his voice breaking. But Lily shook her head. "I was never lost," she said. "I just had to find my way." As they walked out of the clearing, hand in hand, the forest seemed to part for them, the shadows receding and the light growing stronger. Lily looked back one last time, and for a moment, she thought she saw the figure from before, its glowing eyes watching her with something that felt like pride. She smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't afraid anymore. And as they emerged from the forest, the sun breaking through the trees, Lily felt a newfound strength within her. She had been abandoned, but she had found her way back. And now she was ready to face whatever came next. Lily and Jack stepped out of the forest, the golden rays of the rising sun bathing them in warmth. The journey they had just endured felt like a dream, a surreal, otherworldly experience that neither of them could fully comprehend yet. The forest, which had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, now felt calm and serene, as though it had been purged of its turmoil. For a moment, they both stood there, taking in the open expanse ahead, breathing in the fresh air that felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of the unknown had lifted. Jack glanced at Lily, still struggling to process what he had witnessed. Just hours ago, she had been confined to her wheelchair, her body frail and dependent on his strength to move through the forest. Now she stood beside him, her posture confident, her movements fluid, her very presence radiating an energy he had never seen before. "Are you really okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of awe and concern. Lily smiled softly, her hand resting on his arm. "I am," she said simply. "I feel whole." As they began the walk back towards civilization, Lily found herself reflecting on everything that had brought her to this moment. The betrayal of her adoptive parents still lingered in her mind, but the anger and bitterness she had once carried felt distant now, like a heavy coat she had finally shrugged off. She had spent so long questioning her worth, believing that her disability had made her unlovable, that she was a burden no one wanted to bear. But the forest had shown her something else, something profound. She wasn't broken. She never had been. Her strength had always been within her, waiting to be awakened. Jack, too, was deep in thought. He had entered the forest driven by guilt, hoping to make amends for the mistakes of his past. He had expected to find danger, perhaps even death, but instead, he had found redemption in the most unexpected way. His bond with Lily had grown stronger through their shared ordeal, and he realized now that his role in her life was not to protect her, but to walk beside her as an equal. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said, breaking the silence. Lily looked at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And you've always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Their journey back to the nearest town was uneventful, the peaceful surroundings a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. When they finally reached the main road, they flagged down a passing car, its driver a kind older man who seemed genuinely concerned for their well-being. He offered them a ride to the local hospital, and though Lily assured him she was fine, Jack insisted on getting her checked out, just to be safe. The hospital staff was stunned by her miraculous recovery, running test after test, but finding no explanation for what had occurred. "It's like your body healed itself," one doctor said, shaking his head in disbelief. Lily only smiled, knowing the truth was something no medical test could ever uncover. Word of their story began to spread, first among the hospital staff and then throughout the town. People were curious, some skeptical, others amazed. News outlets caught wind of it, and soon reporters were knocking on their door, eager to hear the tale of the young woman who had defied all odds. Lily and Jack chose to share their stories selectively, focusing not on the supernatural elements, but on the lessons they had learned. They spoke about resilience, about the importance of human connection, and about finding strength in the face of adversity. Their message resonated with many, inspiring others to confront their own challenges with courage and hope. As time went on, Lily found herself drawn to advocacy work, using her newfound platform to speak out for children with disabilities and those who had been abandoned or mistreated. She started a foundation dedicated to providing support and resources for foster children, ensuring that no child would have to face the kind of rejection she had endured. Her work brought her immense fulfillment, and she often thought back to the forest, drawing on the lessons it had taught her whenever she faced obstacles. Jack, meanwhile, found his own way to contribute. He became involved in community outreach programs, helping to mentor at-risk youth and guide them toward brighter futures. The bond between him and Lily only grew stronger over the years, their shared experience in the forest serving as a foundation for the deep respect and love they had for each other. They often returned to the forest together, not out of fear or obligation, but as a way to honor the place that had changed their lives forever. The memory of her adoptive parents still lingered in Lily's mind, but she no longer felt the sting of their betrayal. Instead, she chose to focus on forgiveness, not for their sake, but for her own. She understood now that holding on to anger would only weigh her down, and she was determined to move forward with an open heart. "They were a chapter in my story," she told Jack one evening as they sat by the fire. "But they're not the whole story. I am." One day, Lily received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from her adoptive mother, who had learned about her work through the media. The letter was filled with apologies and regrets, the words trembling with guilt and sorrow. "I was wrong," it read. "I see that now, and I can never undo the pain I caused you. But I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Lily held the letter in her hands for a long time, her emotions swirling. In the end, she decided to write back, not to reopen old wounds, but to offer the closure they both needed. Her words were simple and kind, a reflection of the peace she had found within herself. As the years passed, Lily's life flourished. She built a network of friends and supporters who shared her passion for making the world a better place. She traveled, spoke at conferences, and even wrote a book about her journey, which became a bestseller. Through it all, she remained grounded, never forgetting the lessons of the forest or the people who had stood by her when she needed them most. Jack remained a constant presence in her life, their friendship evolving into something deeper over time. They eventually settled in a quiet town near the edge of the forest, where they could still feel its presence, a reminder of where their story had begun. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees, and talk about the journey that had brought them there. In the end, Lily's story was not just about survival, it was about transformation. She had been abandoned, but she had found herself. She had faced darkness, but she had discovered light. And through it all, she had learned that even in the most challenging moments, there is always a path forward, as long as you have the courage to take the first step.